LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 2 of our interview with Frank Joseph, discussing his book, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials, The Real War of the Worlds. The interview resumes as we examine Nazi Germany's exploration of Antarctica, the US military's mysterious mission to Antarctica in Operation Highjump, and the South Polar region as a potential location for extraterrestrial bases. Okay, well, we spoke a few minutes ago where we referred to the Nazi weapons program during World War II, specifically its high-end technology and secret programs, only some of which were ever actually realized. But you do talk further about the Nazi regime of World War II with regard to various overlaps, not least of which, you began by pointing out that during the First World War, UFO or ET interference affected both sides in the conflict, or all sides, shall we say, because there was multiple ones. You mentioned an interesting historical event about which I knew nothing previously, which was a Nazi expedition to the Antarctic just prior to the start of the Second World War, bearing in mind that the Nazi regime came to power quite some time before the Second World War actually started. There was a 1938-39 expedition, and there was talk about an ice-free region in the Antarctic. And having done a little bit of research since, I was not aware that these places really existed, and they refer to them as Antarctic oases, which is a bit ironic because, of course, that they're quite sterile and arid. So as well as talking about that pre-war Nazi expedition, you then, of course, in due course, come on to the US military's Operation Highjump and the Battle of Antarctica, which takes up quite a section of your book. And while reading all of this very interesting material, I was reflecting on the fact that for some reason the Antarctic has had a great pull on the human imagination, particularly of writers and other creative people, and impacted on popular culture. This could be anything from theories about Atlantis, did it exist? Where was it located? People have pointed out that at one point the Antarctic was ice-free and quite lush. And I started thinking about the movies. You've got Who Goes There, the Thing, they're located in the Antarctic. The point being that the whole location itself has got tremendous mystery about it, mystery and danger and the unknown. There's the land that time forgot there. That story involves the island of Caprona, which is in the region of the Antarctic. So I've gone off on that tangent because I think this happens to any part of our world, whether it be mental or physical, whatever it happens to be that is unknown. We populate it with we populate with all sorts of things because we just don't really know what's there. And I think if in due course, if the time comes again that the Antarctic is ice-free and we have the opportunity to really explore it, we may well find things that change our view of human history.
Well, you raised some very interesting points, of course. And Antarctica, I agree with you 100%. If we knew more about what's under the ice, that we would learn a great deal of information that might totally change our concepts of history and natural science. That's entirely possible. Probably more than possible, probably inevitable. But as regards UFOs associated with Antarctica, that began with the German expedition of late 1938 into early 1939. The Germans sent a single ship called the Schwabenland down to Antarctica for the sole purpose of scientific investigation. It was not a military invasion. I've seen it characterized as such, or it had absolutely no military implications whatsoever. All the people involved with it were involved actually for two reasons, primarily scientific. What they wanted to do was to fly over areas of Antarctica that had never been charted before, never even been seen before. And so the Schwabenland had two long-range seaplanes on board, and they brought along literally miles and miles of film so that when they flew over these areas, they were going to document them for the first time from the air. Aerial archaeology at that time was relatively new, and the use of aircraft in science was still relatively new. But these long-range seaplanes, Dorniers, would have been quite good for doing that. And the second reason was, as everything you might understand the Third Reich was, it was for propaganda purposes as well. Look what great job, what great stuff we're doing, scientific stuff, and it was also to polish up the German image. There were no weapons brought along, no tanks or anything, or submarines, nothing like that. A lot of nonsense has been written about the German involvement in Antarctica, and I went out of my way to spend a lot of time tracing down as many of these stories and seeing how much of it was true or not. And I found out that the vast majority of it was untrue. The Germans, during World War II, had their hands full just trying to interdict the North Atlantic convoys, and they certainly had no crews or submarines left over to do any kind of a base in Antarctica. Having a base in Antarctica would have been totally out of the war zone, would have had no effect whatsoever on the course of the war, and the Germans knew that, and they never had any kind of military involvement down there whatsoever. In the Arctic and the North, at the North Pole area, northern polar regions, no doubt the Germans were very interested in attacking the convoys that went from Britain to Murmansk in Russia. That's what they were very interested in, but nothing in the Antarctic. But you bring up a really interesting point. Well, why is it that we nonetheless hear so many reports, and many of them are valid, about UFO sightings and UFO activity in Antarctica? And that question was addressed by a Soviet scientist whose name I cannot remember. I'm sorry. I have so many details in the book, I'd have to go look him up again. That he's in my chapter on Operation Highjump. And I should say before I mention him that Operation Highjump was the name, rather strange name too, for an operation which was a military operation. It was nothing less than a military invasion undertaken by the United States Navy, led by none other than Admiral Richard E. Byrd, who was one of the most famous personalities of the first half of the 20th century, polar explorer. And this was a major military attack on the Antarctic region. I mean, how insane does that sound? Nobody supposedly lives. No, there are certainly no military facilities of any notes down at the South Polar regions, and yet the United States, immediately after World War II, beginning in late 1946, launched a substantial, large naval flotilla and got involved in a shooting engagement, series of engagement in which aircraft were shot down, ships were sunk, men were killed, lost, other men were injured, and this operation, known as Operation Highjump, was defeated, was driven out of Antarctica, and had to make port in Chile in order to make repairs and in order to assist in the medical operations that were being involved on casualties. So what on earth was that all about? When I first heard about this, I thought this was science fiction. I just dismissed it. I knew about it for years, but I thought just a story. Until I just figured, well, this is long before I even began contemplating writing military encounters with extraterrestrials, although this was one of the factors that made me want to write the book. Out of just sheer curiosity, I went to Wikipedia one day and looked up Operation Highjump, expecting that it would be some kind of a science fiction thing. And lo and behold, even on Wikipedia, they describe it as something that actually happened, that this was a real operation that was launched by the United States Navy. And Wikipedia, bless their hearts that put that together, the editors there, they put in a lot of source materials, and I checked out every one of them. And some of those source materials were nothing less than the website, the official website for the U.S. Navy. And boy, I learned a lot from these Navy records about Operation Highjump. And that's why I wrote 4 chapters. There are 4 chapters of the book that are dedicated to it. And I don't know any other book that goes into such detail about it, but I was amazed at what happened. And in Antarctica, a place which supposedly is uninhabited, nobody lives there except maybe a dozen scientists from different parts of the world. Actually, in 1946, there was absolutely nobody living down there. There was no life except animal life. That's all. And yet, the United States goes down there and gets whipped, gets routed. What on earth was that? So that's what I really wanted to look into. And a Soviet scientist who also paid close attention to Operation Highjump long after this incident said that, yes, it makes sense that there are so many UFO sightings associated with Antarctica, and that this battle did, in fact, take place, is because of the magnetic configuration of our planet. In other words, we are like a great geomagnet in which the magnetosphere of our planet is strongest at either pole, at the North Pole or the South Pole, especially at the South Pole. And that if these craft, he is making a supposition here, if these craft do in fact have some kind of electromagnetic properties to them, and it appears that they do, given the accounts that we have of UFOs in the aggregate, in toto, there seems to be an electromagnetic component to the craft that operate in our atmosphere and probably between worlds. And the reason I mention that is that many incidents, it's common, in which aircraft, human-run aircraft, piloted aircraft, come in close proximity to these vehicles, that the American, or usually the American, but other craft, they experience electromagnetic problems. And that the farther away that the UFO goes, the less these electromagnetic problems are in evidence. Boy, you see that all the way from World War II right up to the present day, where modern jets, for example, are scrambled to make an interception. They get within firing range, and just about as they get within firing range of their cannons, the aircraft begin to experience electromagnetic anomalies. So their compasses go out, their avionics begin to deteriorate, and so forth. That actually is common. So the Soviet scientists projected the hypothesis to the effect that these UFOs, UFO operators, aliens, whatever you want to call them, that if they wanted to have a base on Earth, the best place to have it would be Antarctica, because here you have literally an ongoing fountain of magnetic source that you can ride. He compared these UFOs to sailing vessels of the ancient past. The sailing vessels, they used the winds, air currents, in order to sail around the world. And once they understood how to apply tacking against the wind and so forth. And that's what these UFOs are able to do also. They're able to use the natural magnetospheric energies of our planet in order to power themselves and travel from one part of the planet to the next. This was even suggested by Admiral Byrd himself in an interview with Chile's leading newspaper, one of the largest newspapers in the world, called El Mercurio. It has a Spanish speaking audience in the many millions, not only in Chile, but throughout South America and in Spain itself, in which Admiral Byrd said that he was talking in 1947 about craft that are able to go from pole to pole in a matter of a very short time. What a very strange thing for him to talk about. This is even long before Roswell and before the big UFO flap of the late 1940s. And he's talking about dangerous craft, and he's not saying craft that we have that are able to travel from pole to pole at great speeds. So I think that the Antarctica factor plays a major role in this whole phenomena.
Well, I want to come back to an aspect of what you just mentioned about electromagnetic interference. Just before I do that, I want to take you out on a limb just for a moment. You're talking about, or we have been talking about, this unusual dimensions of Antarctica. There is, if I recall correctly, there is some brief mention in all of this of the moon in your book, and it's another part of our reality that has been mesmerizing for humanity as far back as we can see into history. And of course, there's been speculation about ET connections and the moon for a long time, particularly as if you wanted to locate yourself close to the Earth but remain hidden from those on the Earth, then perhaps the far side of the moon might be somewhere that you could do that, not unlike Antarctica. When we were talking earlier about the aftermath of Roswell and everything that went on at the Hanford Engineering Works in the US, the development of nuclear weapons, you spoke about ET activity intervening to prevent weapons development, particularly potentially catastrophic weapons development, as in nuclear weapons. It could be the end of the species, could be the end of life on the whole planet, potentially. And in reading about the moon in all of this, I have read various testimony, accounts, and speculation about some of our forays off planet, specifically those regarding the moon, where people have said something was watching, something intervened, and as the same as with nuclear weapons, as far as the moon and potentially beyond went, the message to us seemed to be, turn back. This is not for you. It's like we're being warded off something.
No, these are all great points you're bringing up, and I'm glad you're doing that. My attention to these questions that you raise was first stated by Sergeant Carl Wolf, and he is a retired United States Air Force specialist, a technical specialist, and he's a very brilliant man. And he has a YouTube in which he's being interviewed. Actually, it's not his YouTube. He's being interviewed about what happened to him in July 1965. He was a photographic repair analysis specialist. He was sent to Colorado's Lowry Air Force Base in order to assist in the repair of the cutting-edge satellite photographic equipment. What this was a satellite. This, of course, is before human beings went to the moon. The Americans landed in July 1969. We're talking about 4 years later, almost exactly 4 years later, in July 1965. No one had been to the moon. However, the United States had sent reconnaissance rockets around the moon, and these rockets were able to go rather closely to the moon and map areas of the moon that were possibly suitable for the future landing that would take place 4 years later. And in the course of taking these photographs, there was a breakdown of some kind, and Sergeant Wolf was sent to Lowry Air Force Base, where this photographic imagery was being collated. And while he was there, he was shown a number of while he was making his repairs, he had to compare the older photographs that had been taken with more recent ones to see what was possibly wrong. And so he was shown some fairly recent photographs that were crystal clear, Before the cameras became unfunctional, they were operating perfectly well, and they took photographs over the surface of the lunar surface, in which they clearly showed very large and unusual buildings. Now, these were not stone formations that looked like buildings. These were definitely structures that were very high. They were spires. It was almost like a small city of very large buildings. And the photographs were unimpeachable. Sergeant Wolf was the leading technician of his kind, and he could distinguish very easily between natural formations and artificial targets. And these were, beyond question, made by intelligent creatures. They were not made by us. We hadn't even been to the moon. We would not land on the moon for another 4 years. And Sergeant Wolf was under orders, of course, to say nothing about this, to make no disclosures. He apparently was not the first or only person that saw these photographs. While he was examining them, a rather large meeting was taking place between U.S. Air Force high-ranking officers and, as Sergeant Wolf said, foreign scientists. They were involved in some very serious discussions about these photographs. Sergeant Wolf could say nothing about this incident until 20 years after he had been mustered out of the Air Force. Then he was legally entitled to go public, and he did. He mentioned nothing about it. He obeyed his orders until 20 years after he had left the Air Force. And in this terrific interview that any of our listeners can see on YouTube, they can just keyboard in Sergeant Carl Wolf, W-O-L-F-E, and lunar photographs, and they will find his interview. He also gave a couple of, and not many, just a couple of lectures about what he saw at Langley Air Force Base. So there is no doubt that there has been, and probably still is, an extraterrestrial base, a serious base, a large one, on the moon. What its purposes are vis-a-vis the Earth, we can only imagine, especially in light of some of the statements made by some of the astronauts, like Neil Armstrong, of all people. Neil Armstrong said that when they were on the lunar surface, they felt that they were being watched. And, of course, many other more disturbing statements have been made by others since then. So I believe, I can only conclude that our lunar satellite has been a base for extraterrestrials for a very long time, perhaps from ancient times on until now.
I want to just talk about some of the physical or non-physical dimensions of all this, and then we'll just close by moving things into the modern era where we find ourselves right now. Thinking about the physicality or otherwise of UFO or ET phenomena, what we quite often is documented or recounted are lights, as opposed to creatures or hard structures. Now, this is, of course, a lot of it can be subjective because we're quite often not sure, people are not quite sure what they're witnessing, what they're looking at. But there also seems to be something that fits with this. There seems to be a lot of talk about, as I mentioned earlier, electromagnetic interference, not so much kinetic as in fire and explosions from the ET side of things. And then we have this problem, if I can put it like that, with military involvement in a lack, or what some people feel is a lack of physical evidence. That is to say that it's either non-existent after the event or it's somehow spirited away. As compelling as the military testimony is, and as we mentioned before, it's where a lot of the activity seems to have been historically and remains so. And then you have these, as you have pointed out, very credible witnesses. But for a lot of people, it's like, well, I haven't seen anything. You know, people may have or may not have their own personal experiences of anomalous phenomena, but I haven't seen any of this in front of my own eyes. You know, I've got people saying that we saw this, And this, of course, leads to a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of debunkers and a lot of skeptics saying this, that, and the other. Despite your book putting out these very compelling testimonies, that is a problem for people, that there isn't anything that they can go and see and touch and experience directly.
Well, I think there is a terrific amount of physical evidence, but as you say, it's not open to the public. We have to understand why the military is acting the way it does. And when I say military, I don't mean just in the United States, but mostly around the world. Belgium is one of the few countries that has disclosed to any meaningful extent their military encounters with extraterrestrials. Outside of Belgium, though, and with some reluctance in the UK, especially in the United States, there has been far less willingness to be open about it. But we have to understand why the military generally acts in this covert manner. And that goes back to the early 1960s. By the early 1960s, literally millions of people around the Earth had seen or claimed to have seen UFOs. And even if only 10% of those sightings were legitimate, and 90% were misidentifications or hoaxes, but if you had at least 10%, that would amount to still a huge number of viable sightings. And so the United States Armed Forces as a whole went to the Brookings Institute in the United States. The Brookings Institute, for our European listeners not familiar with it, is a kind of a think tank, an advisory institute, a multi-million-dollar, probably now multi-billion-dollar advisory institute, highly respected by government people and military people in the United States. And in effect, United States military men asked the Brookings Institute what would happen if we thoroughly disclosed everything that we know about the UFOs. What would happen if everybody understood in the world that, yes, we're having these visitations going on. What would be the sociological implications of such recognition? And the Brookings Institution came back and said that if ever such a revelation was to take place, that there would be social dislocation on an unprecedented scale. Religions would collapse, government authority would collapse, and people would literally run amok in the streets. Now, whether that's true or not, that is what the Brookings Institution officers told our military. And from that point on, the military said, that's enough for us. We will never disclose anything. We will debunk everything conceivable. We cannot take any chance with that. This opinion goes back to none other than Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was told during World War II by many of his officers that they had encountered things over Europe which were not German. They had no idea what these things were. And Churchill just dismissed them all as fatigue and so forth until 1942. In 1942, Churchill was presented with unequivocal evidence that one of his crews had engaged in a real fight, a firefight in which the Wellington bomber, Wellington was a large medium bomber, was under close guard by one of these objects, and the Wellington bomber had opened fire on it in a concerted fire for a long time, and that the crew of the Wellington bomber, even though they were afraid that they might be considered crazy and so forth, they all testified to what they had seen, and that convinced Churchill that this was real. And Churchill, now this is all released in the London Telegraph newspaper. This came out only about a year and a half, I don't think 2 years ago. This was secret information, classified information from World War II, but now it's been disclosed, and Churchill said that any time that any of our RAF personnel encounter these things, it's to be jumped on and classified and not regarded as anything we can release to the public, because the sociological implications would be dire. And he talked also about public faith in religion and government being shaken by this. I don't really see the connection for that, but he did, and others at the Brookings Institution were afraid that that's what would happen. And people would just become unhinged. And so he kept that secret all throughout his life. He knew he was a great believer in the UFOs, as was also President Truman, General Eisenhower. That's all has come out since then, but they all publicly said, oh, no, it's a bunch of nonsense. But they knew secretly that these things were really taking place. It lends a lot of terrific credibility to this phenomena, I feel, but it also explains why they have never disclosed any of these, or very little of this information, because they're afraid that their whole civilization will unravel as a consequence. I don't believe that will happen. There might be some disquiet, but I don't believe that people will just go crazy in the streets. I think we're long past that point.
Okay, well, we're talking about the potential for disclosure and what might stand in the way of that. I've met a lot of people over the years who are very interested in this subject, and they spend a lot of time researching and taking part in conferences and writing articles and books about all of this. And for them, disclosure always just seems to be just around the corner, and it's just about to come out. And some of them are more, how can I put it, reality-based than others. But regardless, given the situation that you just described and that I've characterized, what do you think could change any of that? Is there anything that would make a difference that would change that official position?
Well, the official position has been slowly eroding over time, and there have been disclosures. I mentioned earlier the Belgian Air Force, but even the United States Armed Forces, especially the United States Navy, has begun a slow process of disclosure. So I think we can hope that it will continue. I'm referring specifically to a disclosure that took place just last December in 2017, where the U.S. Navy was able to disclose encounters that were made between 2 or 4 of their air crews, and an object which they tried to close with over the Pacific. There were some naval training exercises that were being held off the South California coast, and this small fleet, a flotilla, had been buzzed by this UFO for a week, and had been seen by at least dozens of Navy personnel, probably hundreds of Navy personnel, had been tracked on radar. All this was officially disclosed last December, just wonderfully, and one of the pilots was given permission to share what he knew, that he had tracked tracked this object very closely, and they even released some of the gun camera film footage that showed how he was able to close on it, and he said that this was unquestionably not of earthly origin, that it totally outflew their craft, that it flew many thousands of miles an hour, was able to make extremely tight turns that would have reduced anybody inside to liquid jelly. So that was either remotely controlled, this object, or else the beings inside were totally different than anything we know here. And the pilot went on national television to say that he felt that this was an object which was piloted or controlled by extraterrestrials. And that's incredible disclosure that has begun to take place. And I feel that this might be part of a process on the part of militaries around the world to slowly acclimatize the masses of people to what this phenomena is, and that perhaps if we're patient, over time more of these disclosures will be made. There have been literally millions of people around the world that have seen these things, and it's impossible to keep it a secret any longer. And that's my hope, is that this disclosure process will continue.
So the objections that we both talked about to this somehow being revealed on Good Morning America, with the president, shaking hands with a space alien, I mean, those objections still exist. So you just can't do it in that way.
Right. I don't know. Of course, no one knows the full nature of this disclosure, but I feel that it is taking place, and it is an ongoing thing. My concern is not that. My concern is that I don't understand, even after having written this book, the nature of this silent war that's taking place. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Whether this war is escalating or it is being downplayed, I don't know. There are all kinds of accounts of supposedly liaisons between earthly military people and unearthly visitors. Your fellow countryman, McKinnon, of course, was able to hack into NASA and bring out some really disturbing material indicating that there is some kind of dialogue, if you can call it that, going on between American forces and intelligences from elsewhere. Whether these are treaty agreements going on, or they're really taking place, or it's a misinterpretation of the evidence, I don't know. All I know is, and I feel very confident in the book, that there is definitely a shooting war going on, in which people on both sides, creatures on both sides, have died. There have been casualties on both sides. And I don't know where it's leading to, especially now that the United States has created a United States Space Force. When we begin to really put atomic weapons into space, what does that mean? How are these intelligences going to view that? Are they going to view that as a threat? Is there some kind of an agreement that's been made? I don't know. That's the disturbing question.
Well, if you look at the way that Gary McKinnon, I'm pretty sure his name's Gary McKinnon, was treated, that tells us something about potential disclosure. But towards the end of the book, you talk about an increase in this sort of activity where we are now in the early 21st century, not least of which around the Fukushima nuclear plant meltdown in Japan. And a very interesting incident that, I mean, I follow the activities of Elon Musk and other kind of techno-utopians quite closely, but his SpaceX rocket launch that was menaced by UFOs, I wasn't aware of that at all.
It was destroyed.
Well, we know that it blew up, but the question is why.
Well, actually, there's not that much of a question to it. It took place on September 1st, 2016. That's not that very long ago. And what's interesting about, of course, Elon Musk is a private individual, and he's mostly interested in the commercial development of spaceflight. But on that particular rocket, which was the Falcon 9 for SpaceX, he was testing an internet beaming satellite called the Amos 6, which had military implications. And although there's nothing officially said about it, I believe I can conclude that there was some military involved. They were interested, the United States Air Force was interested in the Amos 6 internet beaming satellite because of its superior communications capabilities. Well, in any case, the Falcon 9 was carrying and testing, about to test anyway, the Amos 6, when it blew up. And when it exploded, the video of it, which you can again see, anyone can see on YouTube, you can just punch that in, the September 1st, 2016 explosion of Falcon 9. You can see this object flying back and forth at high speed between the towers, and it makes one close pass, and as it makes one close pass, the entire rocket blows up. Now, that video has been analyzed and reanalyzed hundreds and hundreds of times, and no one has been able to show that there's been any manipulation of that video. There's been no photoshopping going on. There's not a misinterpretation of a bird or a bug, nothing like that. And what's amazing is that even skeptics, hard skeptics, say that that rocket was destroyed, although the skeptics say, oh, maybe it was destroyed by a competitor. Well, that competitor was not earthbound. And Elon Musk himself said, in a statement, as an astounding statement that he made afterwards, he said, and quote, "The engines of Falcon 9 were not on, and there was no apparent heat source." This is him saying, "We have not ruled out that a UFO may have caused the SpaceX explosion. And even months after that, he would go back to it and he'd say, I cannot understand why that exploded. We have no logical explanation for it. And I believe that the Falcon 9 was selected, was singled out for destruction by the UFOs. They did not want that communications satellite in orbits for the military to use. There have been other instances like this in the past. It's not anomalous. And I don't know, though, what the nature of this war is. I don't know how far it's going to go. It could result in our extinction. It definitely could. If the extraterrestrials, or whatever we want to call them, the aliens, feel that we become a serious threat to them, that they can no longer tolerate advanced nuclear weapons going throughout our solar system and beyond, then I think that if I was in their shoes, I would do the same thing. I mean, it's a matter of their future survival. It doesn't take much extrapolation to see that going from a Falcon 9 to something in another 100 years would be of a great threat to them. All they have to do is to introduce a pathogen from another world that will exterminate all human life here. They don't have to invade us in some kind of a dramatic Hollywood-type war of the worlds. It'd be a very simple thing for them to grab something off of some exoplanet, beyond our reach, and to introduce some bacteria that would destroy us. And that's a real possibility. I feel that is a real possibility. If we become too much of a threat to them, if we cross that line, if we don't have any kind of agreements with them, which we may have, as McKinnon has pointed out, we may have agreements with them, who knows? Then I think that we might self-destruct in that way.
What you just said recalls, of course, in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, how the common cold on Earth wiped out the Martian invaders. But
it can play the other side of the coin, too.
Exactly.
They can introduce some kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Little distraction just popped into my head suddenly. Have you had the time or the inclination to consider whether any of the modern flight disappearances, I mean, there's been planes just going missing and not accounted for since the era of flight began. But for example, like Malaysia Airlines 370 in 2014, have you had any chance to look at that and think about, because those are incidents like that are complete mysteries to us at the minute?
Yes, it's a possibility. I wouldn't rule that out. I don't have any hard documentation that would indicate that that's what happened with Flight 370. It's complex, but it's entirely possible. The reason why I say it's possible is because of a abundantly documented disappearance, one of the most terrifying incidents in the entire book, and that took place in 1952, I believe, if I can remember correctly, and involved the disappearance of two flight officers, First Lieutenant Felix Mancla and his flight officer. They were aboard a Scorpion aircraft, a jet plane that was flying over Lake Superior, the Great Lakes, and they were investigating a large UFO. Their radio transmissions indicated that they were in close pursuit of it, that it was not flying particularly fast, and that on the radar screens in Michigan that were monitoring the progress of the Scorpion and Mancla's aircraft, that the two blips on the screen, the UFO, the larger blip, and the blip of the aircraft merged. Radio communication went dead. The blips merged into one large blip. The blip of the UFO vanished off the screen at an impossible speed, as it was described, and nothing of the aircraft or of the two men were ever found again. No wreckage, nothing. There was a thorough search between American and Canadian authorities for over a month. Nothing was found. It would appear from everything that's known about that incident is that Mancla and his aircraft were abducted in midair and have never been seen again. what became of them, what they saw, what they experienced, I shudder to think. But that is not the only incident, but that is among the very best documented. Military and newspaper reports are available, and I put them in the book. So abductions have taken place, and I'm sure still do take place, and possibly even I wouldn't know what motivation the aliens would have for taking an airliner, unless there were special people on board, perhaps. But I do know that they have definitely abducted they have definitely abducted military aircraft, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States.
Well, one of the first lines of inquiry that those looking into the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was that who was on board and was there anyone significant? And they did throw up a couple of figures, I think, who they felt were significant, but that's quite subjective as well. Significant in what way and to whom? So that there was nothing conclusive there. So just two final points before we wrap up today, Frank. There's nothing in any of the evidence or in any of the material that you bring together in your book to rule out the possibility that the ETs are interdimensional. That is to say, they may have some physical reality as we understand it, but they may move between this reality and some other that in a way that we don't yet understand. That doesn't rule out them being physically here part of the time. What do you make of, and this is just a general point, the ideas that you've probably come across in your reading and research over the decades, that UFOs, ETs, whatever, are either some kind of collective projection along the lines of Carl Jung's ideas about that, or that they are somehow psychic phenomena, that there is no tangible physical 3D reality to these things, but they are mental manifestations.
Yes, I'm familiar with these hypotheses, and they're certainly not to be ruled out because we don't know one way or the other. I can only tell you honestly, after researching all this material for so many years and trying to get some kind of a collective picture out of it, my own conclusion is that there is some physical reality to the aliens. However, I don't believe they travel in straight lines from, say, Earth to some exoplanet 20 million light years from now. In numerous reports of the UFOs, not all of them, but a great deal of them, the UFOs sometimes begin to manifest. In other words, they just don't fly into view like an airplane. They sort of materialize. More often than that, they are seen to dematerialize. They don't always just fly away. Mostly, in most of the reports, they do. They fly away at incredible speeds so that they're not seen anymore. But there are a great many reports of where the observer will see the UFO kind of dematerialize. What I believe is taking place is that the craft itself, if it is a craft, the reason I say that is because some people suggest that it has an organic quality to it, but if it is a craft, that it has the powerful ability to warp space and time within its immediate vicinity. It creates a kind of, we lack words to describe something we don't understand, a kind of gyroscopic, centrifugal force, which is able to, like a whirlpool of some kind, which is able to warp space and time. If you want to travel between point A and point B in a straight line, it'll take you a long time. However, let's say on a piece of paper, you have you draw a circle, and then you draw another circle, and between these two you have a straight line. Well, if your pen or your pencil follows along that straight line, it takes so much time to get from point A to point B. You can get there much faster if you take the piece of paper and you fold the two pieces together so that point A and point B are touching. And I think that is in essence what these craft are able to do. I think that they create a kind of a vortex or an eddy of some kind in their immediate locale that is able to warp space and time, and that's how they're able to travel instantly from one place to another. That is probably a crude explanation of basically how these things work. And there is an electromagnetic quality to it. Somehow they're able to focus into the great powers of our own magnetosphere, as that Soviet scientists speculated many decades ago, and are able to use this tremendous power to create their own locality, their own local reality.
Okay, final point. From personal perspective, I have never witnessed, in terms of the phenomena that we've been speaking about, I've never witnessed anything anomalous in my life so far. My only relevant personal experience, I would say, is that I used to live in a place called Rendlesham Park, which was accommodation that was provided for the American forces, Air Force, stationed in the UK in Suffolk at Rendlesham Air Force Base. I think it was called something else actually, but Rendlesham was the area, because nearby to where I lived, out the back actually, was Rendlesham Forest. And it was the late 90s when I lived there, but I used to walk in the forest, and it was only when I first moved there that I was reminded that that was the scene of a famous UFO/ET incident from 1980. And all I will say is that the forest itself, which I just like spending time in woodland generally, but it had a really unique, strange atmosphere, and it was very, very quiet all the time, and I never witnessed any wildlife there at all. I might have got that wrong. I might have walked through there and yes, there were birds, but I didn't notice them. But my abiding memory is of complete silence, not unpleasantly so, complete silence and absence of wildlife. And so if people want to know what the Rendlesham Forest incident was, 1980, just look it up, Google it, and you'll find all the information about that. So what I wanted to ask you was, do you have any personal experience in any dimension of any of the things we've been talking about?
Well, 2 points there. Your experience in the Rendlesham Forest is not entirely unique. We have the same thing here in the United States. In the state of Illinois, in southern Illinois, there is a forest. I don't even know its name because it's not a state forest. It's just a natural forest. And it is extremely peculiar because you can go in there in the springtime, and any forest anywhere in the United States during the springtime is alive with bird calls and animals all over and so forth. That forest has this numbing silence. I was there once, many years ago. I didn't associate it with, matter of fact, the other people that I was with, we were there on an archaeological tour and kind of a small expedition that came to nothing. But when we went into that forest, it was incredibly eerie. There was not a sound, and it didn't make any sense whatsoever. There's no stirring, no squirrels, not a bird call. And that place is known also regionally for being, well, they refer to as haunted. There's all kinds of stories associated with it, but there are other places in the world that have this quality of silence in which you feel you're either being watched or something is impending. Something's going to happen. It's like you, I love the forest. I love being in there. And I live in a forest right now. As a matter of fact, our home is in a forest. But that area, I will never go back to again. It had a very creepy feeling. As far as personal experiences, I hate to admit it, but all my life, I had no experiences at all. I had friends who had. My father was a terrific astronomer. He kept a very open mind on the subject, and he told me to keep an open mind, not to be one way or the other. And it wasn't only until the July of 2016 where my wife and I had a superb sighting. I'm reluctant to even describe it because it seems so incredible, but about 3 miles from where I am right now, not far from the Mississippi River, during the 4th of July celebration, in which fireworks are shot off, we witnessed no less than 15 UFOs. And these were not drones, these were not airplanes, these were spheres that traveled across the sky at about 300 feet, very slowly. They traveled in threes. They had what looked like some kind of fire. That's the only way I can explain it. It looked like fire descending out of the bottoms of each one, and it was as though they were on a railroad track in the sky. They flew. Now, I've been watching airplanes all my life. My father was also a terrific pilot, and I've been flying since I was 2 or 3 years old. And these were not so much as flying like an airplane flies, as though like they were being, the only way I can describe it is like they're picked up and moved through the sky. They were like on a railroad track. They all drifted towards the west in exactly the same pattern. And it was astounding. I mean, it actually happened. I didn't write my book because of that. I was already writing the book when we saw this. It was one of the great experiences of our lives. I mean, when we first arrived home after seeing it, we couldn't even speak to each other. We just looked at each other in absolute awestruck amazement at what we had seen. But it was real. I mean, I swear by my life that what we saw was real. And there's no mistaking them for anything else. They were not airplanes. They were too slow for airplanes. They were too fast for balloons. They were not drones. Drones make noise. Drones make a lot of noise. And they were not drones. I've never heard of a drone having fire coming out of the bottom of it. They were not that high. They're about 300 feet high. And the only, strangely enough, my wife and I both conclude the only reason that they were there was to watch our fireworks display. I think that they just liked watching the fireworks display. It seems funny or crazy, but that was the impression we got, that they just came there to see us run off the fireworks. And the other strange thing about it was they only appeared exactly when the fireworks began, and they left precisely when the fireworks were over. They didn't arrive early like the crowds did, and the fireworks that they have here, they never begin at the same time. They always begin at a different time. How did these, whatever they were, know to arrive at precisely the moment the fireworks began, and to time themselves that they would leave precisely when the fireworks ended? So we saw them for, in other words, we saw them for about 20 minutes. That's a long sighting. It was a superb sighting. I feel blessed that we saw it. We were just, it was one of the greatest experiences that anybody could have. But it was real. It was not a misidentification.
The historic characterization of ETs has been called mechanical, well, just what they are, alien, but I don't know, maybe they've got a playful side, or, they like entertainment, or maybe that's an aspect of us that they find uniquely puzzling and bizarre and they want to study, but that's a topic for another day. Today, Frank, we've been talking about one of your recent books, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials, The Real War of the Worlds. That's widely available. Just before we finish for today, is there anything you'd like to share with listeners? As I mentioned, you've got another recent book out. Maybe you want to talk about website, anything you might be working on, just anything you'd like to share.
Well, the only thing I want to say is I thank you very much for your wonderful discussion. I feel we had less of an interview than a real discussion. You're very knowledgeable on this subject, so I really enjoyed it. Mostly I don't do radio shows as much anymore, interviews of this kind, but I certainly did this one. And I'm very grateful for that, Greg. It was very kind of you to do that. And, I worked on another book which came out a little bit earlier this year. It's called Power Places, and it's about just interesting sites around the world in Europe and America and elsewhere that are not often discussed, like the Gold Pyramid House in the United States, and some of the interesting places that are not often discussed. That's called Power Places, and it has nothing to do much with UFOs, although there is some of that, like the Bimini Triangle. That sort of a thing is also mentioned. The Bermuda Triangle, I guess they refer to it as in other places. But as far as the book is concerned, yes, it's available, I guess, at Amazon.com. That's the easiest place to get it. And I hope our listeners have found our discussion interesting today.
Splendid. Well, once again, Frank, thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you very much, Greg. I hope we can do it again sometime.